Hello and welcome to lesson number 15 entitled Documentation. Once we have completed this lesson, we should be very familiar with the following. The definition of documentation. We'll talk through what is GDP or good documentation practice and why we should document accurately and correctly. There are a list of several different types of documentation in the pharmaceutical or manufacturing sector, but the three that I will focus on today is SOPs, standard operating procedures, specifications and batch manufacturing records. I look at the documentation rules, and along with that I'll just highlight some of the observations on poor GDP that are commonly brought up during audits, controlling documents and retention of the documents. So in this slide, we talk about the definition of what a document is, and simply put, documents are approved instructions, either in paper or electronic form, which provides guidance on how an activity shall be executed. And similarly, or along with that, records provide evidence that activities have been performed or results have been achieved according to those documented instructions. So this is a simple excerpt from an FDA warning letter, again taken from the FDA website that you should be familiar with. Complete, true and accurate records are the foundation for good GMPs. Reliable documentation is a control which raises assurance of the quality of the product manufactured. Violations concerning inadequate documentation are serious and should be handled as such. So what is GDP or good documentation practice? So documents must be accurate, so they must be true, precise and error-free. They must be concise, so short and clear information that is understood by all. Legible. They should be clearly readable and understandable by its user. Traceable, so who recorded it, when, where and how. They should be contemporaneous, so documented at the time the activity was carried out. They should be enduring or long-lasting and durable. And finally, they should be accessible, which is easily available and retrievable at all times. So why should we document? Well, GMP and ISO 9001 requires the documentation is documented and followed through at all times. And one of the sayings as such is that if it's not documented, then it hasn't been completed. So during an inspection, auditors will want written documented answers to the following four basic questions. They'll ask you, what are you doing and why are you doing it? And are you doing what you have said you're going to do? And are things under control? And in order to answer those questions, you have to have approved documents that you're following and approved records that as proof that you've carried out your procedure correctly. So why document? Well, it reduces the risk of errors in oral communication. So written communication stays constant or consistent at all times, and documents can be easily rechecked if there is an uncertainty. There are fewer misunderstandings, of course, with written communication, and direct backup evidence of the communication is available through documentation. Documents help with decision making. Assuming recorded information is correct, then documents can be used as a basis for decisions and for process improvements. Documents ensure consistency, so a product is produced in the same way to the same standards repeatedly when the procedure is well documented and accessible. Records preserve data and observations, and we're less likely to make the same mistake again if we document the issue. Sign off on procedures puts accountability for proper performance of procedures with the person who does them. And finally, documentation allows for traceability. So you can easily pull out a document during audits. It permits deviation investigations. It allows us to gain baseline information for continual improvement projects. And it permits investigation and tracking of defective product. And that's all tied in with CAPA, corrective and preventative actions, which we'll speak about in a later lesson. So, as previously mentioned, there are a vast array of documents that are used commonly in the manufacturing or the pharmaceutical sector. Some of them are related to instructional documents, and they're standard operating procedures or specifications. And a lot of them are related to the recording of the data or the reporting of the data through batch manufacturing records, or BMRs, which we'll talk about in more detail later in the lesson. QC results are obviously documented and reported as soon as they're obtained. Change control records must go through a documentation process, as well as deviation reports, validation protocols and reports, training records, cleaning logs, shipping details, purchasing records, and research and development reports. So in general, this is just a schematic of how a document is generated and approved. So firstly, the document is generated and that's submitted to the relevant personnel within the department for review. So that cycle can continue for quite some time, including additional information or deleting information or just making it clear. Once it's reviewed, it then goes for approval within the department. So if it's a quality control document, the approval is normally signed off by the lab supervisor or the team leader. It's also signed off by QA approval. So all documents will get QA approval. Again, that cycle can continue, the review and approval cycle, until it's actually complete and accurate. And once it is approved, it's sent for distribution throughout the site or throughout the department that it's involved in. What I haven't listed here is if there is an update to a procedure that requires retraining, then you need to have approved a procedure for training or retraining or reskilling upskilling the analysts that are actually going to use that procedure. And finally, you have to have a procedure for retention of the documents and archive of older versions of documents once they're approved or updated. So standard operating procedures are the first document type that I'll go into in more detail. An SOP is a documented instruction on all aspects of the company's operations, and they must be written in a format that's clear, concise, instructional, and logical. So what is your responsibility in relation to SOPs? Well, you must ensure that you're trained in the SOP at all times, so you never pick up and follow a procedure that you're not trained in, and that you have documented evidence of your training. There's a responsibility on the analyst to ensure that they understand the task and the information in the procedure, and that you're able to undertake the task. You must report inconsistencies between standard operating procedures and practice to your supervisor, and that's a very key responsibility, because if there's an error within your procedure, that must be highlighted and flagged, and the procedure must be updated as soon as possible, because it might prevent an error or a deviation if it's not approved or updated. And updated SOPs as requested by supervisor. So SOPs are periodically reviewed and updated, sometimes yearly, and sometimes clarification is needed in the procedure, or if an instrument changes in any way, the SOP must be updated to reflect those changes. So the elements of an SOP, it's quite a beefy document in that it must contain quite a lot of information, and formats vary from company to company, but there are certain sections and types of information that are typically included within a standard operating procedure, and these sections are illustrated below. So the first one is the title and SOP number. So each procedure should have a title and a unique identification number. It's also a good idea to build in a facility to deal with updated versions. So normally we give it a number and a rev number, so we can follow the history of that procedure. Effective date and or revision date, and this is to prevent premature use and the use of outdated SOPs or archived SOPs. The revision history is a history of the changes made to the document since its first issue, with reasons for the change. So normally at the back of the procedure we give the rev number, and we give the reasons for change. So we highlight what changes have been made within the SOP on that revision. Page number, each page should be numbered, so it should be page X of Y, and this prevents any mislabeling or any pages going missing. The purpose of the SOP is stated at the beginning, along with the scope, what the SOP covers. The responsibility includes a list of the people who should use the procedure and therefore who should be trained on the procedure. An SOP will always include an environmental health and safety section. SOP should briefly inform operators or analysts of any hazards associated with the materials or the completion of the procedure and how to protect themselves from dangers. More information is normally available in the MSDSs, the material safety data sheets associated with the chemicals that are being used. Environmental precautions are also mentioned here, so disposal of your solutions and safe handling of hazardous material. So the procedure itself then is the core of the SOP, and it should be detailed out in full step-by-step chronological order. And of course, you can use visual aids where possible, like pictures and diagrams or color coding to encourage clarity and ease of use. And the last three then, abbreviations and definitions, as well as references, speak for themselves, and the signature of the document creator and approvers are all included in the standard operating procedure. So the revision of the SOPs, they should be revised after a set period of time, normally 2 years, but that can be a lot sooner than that if it's deemed appropriate. And they should be revised after a process change or a regulatory change. So the SOP cycle is it's a document that's considered to be a living document, so it's constantly changing, being reviewed and updated as necessary. SOP administration then, so once an SOP has been written, agreed and approved, there should be formalities for putting it into operation. So there should be a chain of approval which should encompass people from the affected departments, and finally QA will always have the final approval sign off on that. And as previously mentioned, if the SOP requires training or retraining or upskilling, that needs to be a formal process to ensure that that actually happens and is documented. So specifications then are documents which describe in detail the following. They can describe starting materials, packaging materials, intermediate materials, finished products, or several different components, labels, containers, anything like that associated with the product. Examples of contents of a specification document should include the description of the material along with the identity and colour, the the strength, assay and potency if it's a raw material or an intermediate, along with the limits of the impurities, water content, acidity and pH. There are several other tests that could be included on the specification if they're deemed appropriate. And I've included a specification doc here for benzylic acid, just so you can see how it's set out. And normally we have a list of the key attributes as well as the limits associated with those attributes and the test method that's used to test. So on the specification for benzylic acid, we test for description, melting point, solubility assay, LOD, sulfated ash, chloride and sulfate. And each one of those tests is carried out using a separate test method, and each one of those tests has its own individual limit. So when you're reporting the results for the tests on that benzylic acid, you report it again, it's in a assertive analysis format where your attributes or your tests are on the left along with your limits in the center, and then your test results along to test methods. And this is where you'll normally flag if your results are failing or if you have any other spec results. And again, you can see that specification docs as well as the certs of analysis or the reported results are signed and dated by the person carrying out the test. So finally, the last type of document we talk about is BMRs, or batch manufacturing records. And BMRs are very important documents used in the manufacturing area. They contain information that relates to the following aspects of manufacture of a batch of product. So normally they have the dates of the start and the finish of the manufacture, or how long the whole process took. It lists all material that were used and the amounts that were used in each step of the process. It will list all the packaging materials used. Details of the steps completed in the manufacturing process and the times the steps were completed. So the operator fills in that details as the operation happens. The operator will fill in when the time it occurred at, and they will initial and date that step. The details and results of all in-process checks are recorded within the batch manufacturing record also. A reference to any equipment used, so any balances that were used, for example, to weigh any of the key material. Batch yield and reconciliation are recorded on the batch manufacturing record, as well as any deviations and any QC information related to the batch. In many cases, batch manufacturing records are written in an instructional format with areas for the operator to fill in the processing information. So it's a working document, it's a live document, and it's used during the process, and that batch manufacturing record can be quite a hefty document because it contains a huge amount of information once the process is complete. It's very important to provide the information in the BMR where requested, and for certain critical operations, for example weighing of raw materials or key intermediates, a second person should check the calculation and identity of the material, and they need to sign off and date the BMR also along with the operator that carried out the task. Batch manufacturing records, each batch has an individual number which is written on the BMR. The BMRs must be legible, they must be permanent, accurate, original, and they must be signed and dated. All corrections and deviations must be recorded and signed off within the batch manufacturing record. So this is a little visual on the do's and don'ts when it comes to documentation. So some of the don'ts include things like pencil, because your documents must be they're retained for quite a number of years, so they must be permanent, and pencil will fade over time or can be changed after the fact. Correction fluid is never to be used because that will obscure the original entry, and sticky tape or labels should never be used, again because it might obscure some of the information within the original document. Never leave blanks in a document, whether it be a batch manufacturing record or a notebook where you're documenting a use of equipment. If there's pages or spaces left on the page, you need to cross through it, NA, sign and date it. Never deface documents, so always keep them clean and tidy, and don't let them become obscured by product or any of the material that you're working with. Should never be allowed near the documents. Always use the correct format for dates. So the correct format would normally be date, year and month. So if you're using that format, then you stick with that format throughout the rest of the document, and you don't you don't swap out your date formats throughout. So you keep the same format throughout your entire document. And you always follow site procedures and write legibly, sign and date where required, because these documents are going to be picked up and reviewed during audit in years to come, and the person who actually completed the document may not be there at the time to answer any questions. So they need to be legible and they need to be able to be read correctly and accurately by a second person. And to correct errors, it's very important not to obscure original data. So when you're correcting errors, the simple rule is to just draw a line through the original data entry, correct it by writing the correct entry beside it, and if you can, write an explanation as to why you've crossed out the original data entry and sign and date that comment. So there's no ambiguity and everything is clear. So moving on then, record writing and data entry. You must enter complete and accurate information at the time the work is performed, so never after the work is performed, never the next day. When one or more person completes a task, then all persons must sign the document. Never sign your name for performance of a job for work performed by somebody else. Use a ballpoint blue or black pen. Don't use gel pens, red or green coloured ink or pencils. Spaces in cells cannot be left blank, so use a not applicable or an NA. Never use ditto marks or use lines with or without arrows in rows and columns. You must fill in accurately every row and every column. Corrections to written records must be made correctly. Never mask or obscure the original entry. Don'ts include remove pages or portions out of a notebook, temporary entries on a piece of paper. So we never want to see sticky notes lying around the laboratory or loose pieces of paper with data entry on it. Sticky notes are a huge no-no for audit, so I've highlighted that one in red. Do not backdate or post-date. That just harps back to the importance of accurately recording data at the time the work is performed. And avoid the use of unbound lab notebooks because pages can easily fall out and get lost. So some observations on poor GDP include things in audits would include things like missing signatures and dates at the time the activity was performed, or non-uniform data and signature used. Activity was performed and written on day 1 and signed off on day 2. Blank spaces being left in notebooks or in records. Illegible writing is another one. Too many corrections, so that the record looks messy, it looks uncontrolled. Too many crossovers or write-overs or multiple lines through aren't considered appropriate. Error corrections not signed and dated and the reason for the correction not given, and not traceable. So you always need to give the reason for your error, and if you had to repeat an assay for whatever reason, you'd reference your deviation number or link a link or traceable link to the reanalyzed result. Controlling documents then, the importance of controlling documents is identifying each particular document with its own number, its own unique number. You must identify the version of the document. So normally we talk about the rev number. That must be visible at the top of the document. And identifying related documents associated with that particular procedure. So if there's a change to your procedure, you must look outside and the change to see has it impacted another procedure. So you'll always reference documents within your SOP. You must identify each page of the document, so page X of Y. Consider security levels for electronic documents, so make sure that they're read-only where appropriate and that they're password protected. Ensuring that only authorized people make changes to documents. Preventing the release or the use of a document before its effective date or after it has been superseded. So if a document is archived and used, that's a serious deviation, or if it's used before its effective date, that's another serious deviation. The distribution of that document needs to be recorded, because again, if it's updated, you need to be able to recall the old documents and replace them with the new documents. So at all times you need to know how many documents have been distributed and their location. So document retention for medical devices, the lifetime of medical devices, the lifetime of document retention within medical devices is normally 2 years from the date of product release. For at least 5 years after the last product has been manufactured, you must hold on to your documents. And in pharmaceuticals, 1 year after the expiry date of the batch, and the exception there being the API, with retest dates at least 3 years after the batch has been completely distributed. Again, that varies from company to company. It's sometimes tighter, but this is just a guideline of how long you should keep your documentation. So in summary, documentation is a record of our product history. GDP documents are legal documents and are absolute requirements. Documents are a way of double checking or reviewing that the work was carried out correctly. All work should be documented at the time the work is performed. Correct the errors properly and accurately. Report the deviations, if any, and implement the change and corrective and preventative actions. And you must train all staff on GDP and explain the consequences of not being fully trained or following GDP practices within the company. And that's the last slide. Thank you guys for listening, and we can move on to the next lesson.